Picture this. You're standing in a room full of successful professionals, watching your own family introduce you as the disappointment, when suddenly the most powerful person in the room stops mid-conversation, points directly at you, and says words that will haunt your relatives for years to come. That's exactly what happened to me when my sister's CEO boss looked me dead in the eye and stammered, "Wait, you're the Director Thompson everyone's been talking about." The champagne glass, slipping from my sister Rachel's perfectly manicured fingers and shattering on the marble floor, was just the beginning. What followed was a revelation so shocking that it turned 26 years of family hierarchy completely upside down, proving that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is actually the one changing the entire game. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and if you asked my family to describe me 6 months ago, you'd hear words like unfocused, idealistic, and their personal favorite, still figuring herself out. At 26, I was the perpetual question mark in a family of exclamation points, the one who chose freelance graphic design over a stable corporate ladder, the daughter who worked from coffee shops instead of corner offices. The Rodriguez family gatherings in our modest ranch house in Maple Heights, a working-class suburb of Cleveland, followed the same script every single time. My father Miguel would update everyone on his progress toward becoming a shift supervisor at the manufacturing plant where he'd worked for 15 years. My mother Sophia would share news about her students at the local elementary school where she taught 3rd grade. Then came the success stories that really mattered. Rachel, my older sister by 4 years, was the undisputed family champion, marketing coordinator at Sterling Communications, one of Cleveland's most prestigious advertising agencies. She drove a leased BMW, lived in a trendy downtown loft, and had a closet full of blazers that cost more than I made in a month. Rachel possessed everything my parents valued: stability, prestige, and most importantly, a salary that didn't fluctuate based on whether clients paid their invoices on time. My younger brother Carlos, 23 and fresh out of college, had already secured a position as a junior analyst at a regional bank. While I was still explaining what brand identity design meant to confused relatives, Carlos was discussing mortgage rates and investment portfolios with the confidence of someone who'd found his place in the world. During these family dinners, I'd sit at the same scratched wooden table where I'd done homework as a kid, listening to detailed reports about office politics, promotion possibilities, and retirement planning. When the conversation inevitably turned to me, the energy would shift noticeably. My father would clear his throat uncomfortably. My mother would smile that patient smile she'd perfected during parent-teacher conferences with difficult children. Emma's still exploring her creative side, she'd explain to visiting relatives, as if artistic work was a phase I'd eventually outgrow, like teenage rebellion or an unfortunate haircut. "She's very talented, but you know how competitive those creative fields can be." The implication was always clear: I was talented but impractical, creative but uncommercial, passionate but ultimately naive about how the real world operated. They loved me, certainly, but they also worried about me in a way that suggested they saw my choices as fundamentally flawed. Rachel particularly enjoyed these moments of family dynamics. She'd lean back in her chair, swirling her wine with practiced sophistication, and offer insights about the marketing industry that highlighted just how little I understood about real business. "Emma could probably do some freelance work for Sterling eventually," she'd say with the air of someone offering charity. "Nothing major, of course, but maybe some small projects. I could put in a word with my boss when she's ready to get serious about her career." The phrase "get serious about her career" became a family favorite, deployed whenever my unconventional choices needed explanation. It suggested that everything I'd accomplished so far was somehow practice for the real work that would begin once I abandoned my foolish independence and accepted a proper job with proper benefits and a proper title that made sense to people at church. My parents' concern wasn't malicious, but it was constant. They'd grown up believing that security came from steady employment, that success was measured in health insurance and vacation days, that taking risks was something only people with safety nets could afford. Watching their daughter choose uncertainty over stability triggered every protective instinct they possessed. "Nija," my father would say during our private conversations, using the Spanish endearment that still made me feel like a little girl. I just want to see you settle. Your sister has a plan, a future. Carlos knows where he's going. But you, I worry that you're just floating. Floating? That word stung more than any outright criticism because it contained just enough truth to burrow under my skin. From the outside, my life probably did look aimless. I worked irregular hours, my income varied wildly from month to month, and I couldn't explain my long-term strategy in the clear, linear terms that made sense to people who'd built their lives around predictability. What they couldn't see, what I struggled to articulate even to myself, was that I wasn't floating at all. I was learning. Every freelance project taught me something new about business, about people, about the gap between what companies said they wanted and what they actually needed. Every difficult client showed me how to navigate personality conflicts and unrealistic expectations. Every late payment taught me about cash flow and the importance of diversifying income streams. But learning doesn't look like progress to people who measure advancement in promotions and pay raises. Growth doesn't register when it happens in coffee shops and home offices instead of conference rooms and corporate campuses. And innovation is invisible when it's happening in industries that your family doesn't understand or respect. The most painful part wasn't the lack of recognition for what I was building. It was the growing realization that my family's love came with conditions they didn't even realize they'd set. They loved the version of me that existed in their imagination. The Emma who would eventually come to her senses and choose security over dream. They struggled to love the Emma who actually existed. The one who found traditional employment stifling, and who got energized by problems that didn't have obvious solutions. This dynamic created a strange double life where I celebrated my successes privately and downplayed my struggles publicly. When I landed a major client or completed a project that exceeded expectations, I'd share the news with my college friends or my mentor, but I'd minimize it at family dinners to avoid the inevitable suggestions about how I could leverage this success into a real job. When projects fell through or clients proved difficult, I'd absorb the stress alone rather than admit to my family that their warnings about instability had merit. I couldn't give them the satisfaction of being right about the risks, and I couldn't handle their gentle pressure to abandon the path I was determined to follow. The isolation this created was profound. The people who loved me most were the ones who understood me least. The achievements that meant the most to me personally were the ones that seemed least impressive to the people whose approval I still desperately wanted. But perhaps the cruelest irony was that while my family saw me as the one who was struggling to find her place, I was actually finding something much more valuable than a place in someone else's system. I was building something entirely my own, something that would eventually redefine not just my position in the family hierarchy, but the very definition of success that had governed our family's values for generations. The transformation that was already beginning would prove that sometimes the person who looks most lost is actually the one who's mapping entirely new territory. Sometimes the family member who doesn't fit the existing mold isn't broken or confused. Sometimes they're just operating on a timeline and scale that hasn't become visible yet. And sometimes the daughter who seems to be disappointing everyone is actually preparing to astonish them in ways they never thought possible. But first, she has to survive the period when her own family's doubt becomes the loudest voice in her head, drowning out the quiet certainty that she's exactly where she needs to be. Rachel's corner of the world represented everything my parents believed success should look like. Her downtown Cleveland loft in the trendy warehouse district showcased exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and furniture that looked like it belonged in architectural magazine. When she hosted family gatherings there, we'd all crowd into her sleek living space, admiring the view of Lake Erie while she served wine in glasses that probably cost more than my monthly phone bill. Sterling Communications occupied the 32nd floor of the Key Tower, Cleveland's most recognizable skyscraper. Rachel never tired of mentioning this detail, especially when giving directions to family members visiting her workplace. "Just look for the tallest building downtown," she'd say with practiced casualness, as if she hadn't spent months rehearsing that line after getting hired. Her role as marketing coordinator came with business cards printed on heavy cardstock, an office with partial lake views, and access to client events where she rubbed shoulders with Cleveland's business elite. She'd return from these gatherings with stories about conversations with CEOs, partnerships with major brands, and campaigns that would be featured in industry publications. During family dinners, Rachel would regale us with tales from Sterling's creative meetings, describing brainstorming sessions where teams of marketing professionals developed strategies for million-dollar accounts. She spoke fluently about market penetration, demographic targeting, and brand positioning, using terminology that made my parents nod approvingly even when they clearly didn't understand the specifics. "We're launching a comprehensive digital campaign for Johnson Industries next month," she'd announce over my mother's homemade enchiladas, pausing to let the significance sink in. "It's a six-figure contract, and my boss specifically requested that I lead the creative development team." My father would beam with pride, reaching over to squeeze Rachel's shoulder. "That's my daughter, the marketing executive, coordinator," Rachel would correct gently, but her smile suggested she didn't mind the promotion and title, though there's definitely room for advancement. "My supervisor has been hinting about expansion opportunities." These conversations established a clear template for family success stories. Real achievements involved impressive office buildings, recognizable company names, and budgets large enough to require multiple approval levels. They came with titles that made sense to strangers, salaries that enabled mortgage applications, and health insurance that didn't require comparing deductibles across multiple provider networks. Carlos, despite being the youngest, had quickly mastered this template. His position at First National Bank of Ohio came with training programs, advancement timelines, and the kind of institutional stability that made my parents breathe easier about his future. Even though he'd only been working there for 8 months, he already spoke confidently about career trajectories and retirement plans. "The banking industry offers incredible growth potential," he'd explain during family gatherings, unconsciously echoing the recruitment materials that had convinced him to accept the position. "There are clear pathways from analyst to associate to vice president. Plus, the connections you make in finance open doors throughout the business community." Carlos had embraced the professional culture with enthusiasm that bordered on zealotry. He owned 3 suits now, read the Wall Street Journal every morning, and had developed opinions about federal interest rate policies that he'd share with anyone willing to listen. My parents found his transformation remarkable and reassuring. "Look at how focused Carlos has become," my mother would say with obvious satisfaction. "He knows exactly where he's going and how to get there." The contrast with my own trajectory couldn't have been more stark. While Rachel navigated corporate hierarchies and Carlos built professional networks, I spent my days in coffee shops and libraries, working on projects that existed primarily in digital spaces. My clients were small businesses, nonprofit organizations, and entrepreneurs who needed creative services, but couldn't afford the rent. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rates charged by established agencies. This work was meaningful to me, but it was also invisible to my family. They couldn't visit my office because I didn't have one. They couldn't meet my colleagues because I worked alone. They couldn't brag about my company because I was my company, and that seemed less impressive than being part of something larger and more established. The physical markers of success that my family recognized were entirely absent from my professional life. I didn't have business cards because most of my networking happened online. I didn't wear suits because my dress code was determined by whether I was meeting clients or working from home. I didn't have a company car or expense account or any of the tangible benefits that made other people's jobs seem substantial and real. My workspace consisted of a laptop, a portable monitor, and whatever table or desk space I could claim at various locations around Cleveland. Sometimes I worked at the West Side Market, surrounded by the sounds and smells of vendors selling fresh produce and artisanal goods. Other days I'd set up camp at Phoenix Coffee in Little Italy, where the baristas knew my order and didn't mind if I occupied a corner table for hours. This nomadic approach to work suited my temperament and creative process, but it reinforced my family's perception that I was somehow playing at being a professional rather than actually being one. Real jobs happened in real offices with real infrastructure. What I was doing looked too much like an extended college experience, too informal and unstructured to qualify as a legitimate career. The generational divide made these perceptions even more entrenched. My parents had built their lives around the industrial economy of mid-20th century Cleveland, where success meant finding stable employment with established companies that offered predictable advancement and reliable benefits. The idea that someone could build a sustainable career by selling services to clients they'd never met, using skills that hadn't existed when they were starting their own careers, challenged everything they understood about how the economy worked. Rachel and Carlos, despite being closer to my age, had chosen paths that aligned with our parents' values and expectations. They'd translated their college educations into recognizable professional roles that fit established templates for middle-class advancement. Their choices validated everything our parents had taught us about the importance of security, credentials, and institutional affiliation. My choices, by contrast, seemed to reject these values entirely. From their perspective, I was gambling with my future, choosing uncertainty over stability, and pursuing personal fulfillment at the expense of practical consideration. They couldn't understand why I'd voluntarily embrace the stress and unpredictability they'd spent their entire lives trying to avoid. But what they interpreted as recklessness or immaturity was actually a calculated response to changes in the economy that they hadn't yet recognized. The traditional career paths that had served their generation well were becoming less reliable and less rewarding for people entering the workforce in the 21st century. Corporate loyalty was no longer reciprocated with job security. College degrees no longer guaranteed middle-class income. The social contract that had governed their professional lives was breaking down, even if the breakdown wasn't yet visible to people who'd already established their careers. I wasn't rejecting the value of hard work or financial stability. I was pursuing both through methods that made sense for the economic reality I was actually facing, rather than the one my family remembered from their own experience. But because my methods didn't look like theirs, they appeared chaotic and misguided. This disconnect created a communication barrier that went beyond simple misunderstanding. We were operating from completely different assumptions about how careers developed, how value was created, and what constituted legitimate work. When I tried to explain my projects and goals, I was speaking a language my family didn't recognize. When they offered advice and guidance, they were solving problems I wasn't actually facing. The result was a kind of loving frustration on both sides. They wanted to help me succeed but couldn't understand what success would look like in my chosen field. I wanted their support and recognition, but couldn't find ways to translate my achievements into terms they found meaningful. We were all acting with good intentions, but we were working from incompatible definitions of progress and achievement. The subtle undermining that characterized my family's response to my career choices operated through 1,000 small interactions, rather than any single dramatic confrontation. It was the way conversations would pause when I entered a room, as if my presence reminded everyone of problems they'd rather not discuss. It was the careful way my accomplishments were acknowledged but never celebrated, recognized but not quite respected. When I landed my first significant client, a local restaurant chain that hired me to redesign their entire visual identity, I was thrilled to share the news during our weekly family dinner. The project represented months of steady income, creative challenges that pushed my skills in new directions, and the kind of comprehensive branding work that established design firms charged premium rates to provide. "That's wonderful, Mija," my mother said, her tone carefully calibrated to sound supportive without being overly enthusiastic. "How many restaurants are in the chain?" 7 locations around Cleveland with plans to expand into Columbus and Cincinnati, I replied, unable to suppress my excitement about the scope of the project. 7 restaurants, my father repeated thoughtfully. "So this is like a small business account." The question contained an implicit comparison to Rachel's work with major corporations, though he didn't need to make the connection explicit. Everyone at the table understood that 7 restaurants didn't compare to the national brands that Sterling Communications represent. "Small businesses are actually a really important market segment," I explained, trying to maintain my enthusiasm while defending the legitimacy of my client base. "They need professional design services, but they can't afford the rates that big agencies charge. There's a real opportunity to provide high-quality work at accessible price points." Carlos nodded politely, but I could see him doing mental calculations about revenue and profit margins. "What kind of timeline are you looking at for completion?" "The initial phase should be finished within 6 weeks, and then there's ongoing work for marketing materials, seasonal campaigns, that sort of thing." "Ongoing work," Rachel repeated, and something in her tone suggested skepticism about the sustainability of client relationships in my field. Is that guaranteed, or more like a possibility? The question highlighted one of the fundamental differences between freelance work and traditional employment. Rachel's salary arrived every 2 weeks regardless of whether her current projects succeeded or failed. My income depended on client satisfaction, project completion, and the constantly shifting priorities of small business owners who might change their minds about design needs based on cash flow considerations. It depends on how the initial work performs, I admit. If their new branding helps increase customer traffic, they'll probably want to continue the relationship. If not, I let the sentence hang unfinished, but everyone understood the implication. My professional success was contingent on variables beyond my control tied to the success of businesses that might fail for reasons having nothing to do with the quality of my work. That's the challenge with creative services, my mother said gently, deploying the careful tone she used when delivering disappointing news to her students. There's so much uncertainty involved. These conversations followed a predictable pattern that reinforced my family's core concerns about my career choices, while maintaining the appearance of supportive interest. They'd ask questions that highlighted the instability and limitations of freelance work. They'd make observations that emphasized the differences between my professional experience and more traditional career paths, and they'd offer suggestions that invariably involved moving towards something more conventional and secure. Have you thought about maybe using this restaurant project as a portfolio piece to apply for positions at established design firms? Rachel would ask. I could introduce you to some people at Sterling who might know about openings in the creative department, or you could look into corporate communications roles, Carlos would add. Banks are always hiring for marketing positions, and the financial services industry offers excellent advancement opportunities. My father's suggestions typically focused on education and credentials. Maybe you should consider going back to school for an MBA. It would give you the business background to understand client needs better, and having that degree would open up management opportunities. These recommendations weren't malicious, but they shared a common assumption that my current path was inherently limited and that real success required transitioning into something more conventional. They couldn't imagine that what I was building might eventually become more rewarding, both creatively and financially, than the alternatives they were suggesting. The most frustrating aspect of these interactions was that they prevented genuine celebration of my achievement. Instead of acknowledging what I'd accomplished, my family's responses immediately redirected attention to what I still needed to do to legitimize my career in their eyes. Success became a stepping stone toward respectability rather than an accomplishment worth recognizing in its own right. This dynamic was particularly painful because it suggested that my family's approval was contingent on my eventual conformity to their expectations. They could tolerate my unconventional choices as long as they believed I was working toward more traditional goals, but the possibility that I might actually prefer the path I'd chosen, that I might find fulfillment and success without following their template, seemed to threaten their fundamental assumptions about how life should work. The restaurant project became a case study in these communication patterns. Over the 6 weeks I spent developing their new brand identity, I'd share updates about creative breakthroughs, positive client feedback, and the satisfaction of solving complex design challenges. My family would listen politely, ask practical questions about timelines and payment schedules, and then pivot to discussions about Rachel's latest promotion opportunity, or Carlos's networking successes. When the project launched and immediately generated positive responses from customers and industry peers, I brought copies of the new menus and marketing materials to show my family. They examined my work with the careful attention usually reserved for children's art projects, offering compliments that felt more obligatory than genuine. "This looks very professional," my mother said, holding up a menu that represented weeks of collaborative refinement with the restaurant's owners. "The colors are nice." Nice was perhaps the most damning praise imaginable for work that had pushed my creative abilities to new levels and resulted in measurable improvements for my client's business. But it captured perfectly my family's inability to recognize the sophistication and impact of what I was producing. Rachel studied the materials with her marketing professional eye, offering observations that revealed both her expertise and her assumptions about the hierarchy of creative work. "The typography is clean, and the layout is easy to read. For a local restaurant chain, this is definitely solid work." The qualifier for a local restaurant chain, contained the entire universe of her perspective. Good work was always relative to expectations, and expectations were determined by the perceived importance of the client and project. Work for small businesses was inherently less impressive than work for major corporations, regardless of the creative challenges involved or the quality of the solutions developed. Carlos approached my work from a business perspective, asking questions about profit margins, client retention rates, and scalability that revealed his assumption that creative services were fundamentally limited as a business model. "How many projects like this would you need to match a corporate salary?" he asked, reducing my career to a simple math problem. These responses weren't intentionally dismissive, but they reinforced a hierarchy of value that placed traditional employment above entrepreneurial work, established companies above small businesses, and stable income above creative fulfillment. My family couldn't celebrate my successes because they couldn't recognize them as genuine successes within their framework for understanding professional achievement. The pressure to conform to my family's vision of successes operated on multiple levels simultaneously, creating a psychological environment where my own instincts and preferences seemed increasingly unreliable. Every career decision became a choice between personal authenticity and family approval, between following my own path and meeting the expectations that had been carefully constructed around me since childhood. The most insidious aspect of this pressure was how it disguised itself as care and concern. My family genuinely worried about my financial security, my professional development, and my long-term prospects. Their suggestions and criticisms came from a place of love, which made them simultaneously more painful and harder to dismiss than simple disapproval would have been. "We just want to see you settled and secure," my mother would say during our private conversations, her voice carrying the weight of parental anxiety that had been building for months. "Your father and I won't be around forever, and we want to know that you'll be okay when we're gone." This fear of abandonment and vulnerability struck at the heart of my own insecurities about choosing an unconventional career path. The independence I valued during successful periods felt like dangerous isolation when projects ended or clients proved difficult. The freedom to set my own schedule and choose my own projects seemed less appealing when I was lying awake at night wondering how I'd pay rent if my current work dried up. My family's concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Freelance work was inherently unstable, subject to economic fluctuations and client whims that could eliminate income streams without warning. I didn't have the safety net of corporate benefits, paid vacation time, or unemployment insurance. If I got sick or injured, there was no disability coverage to replace my lost income. If the economy tanked, I couldn't count on steady employment to carry me through difficult periods. These vulnerabilities were real, and acknowledging them required a level of risk tolerance that my family found genuinely frightening. They'd built their lives around minimizing uncertainty, choosing security over opportunity whenever possible. Watching their daughter voluntarily embrace the kind of instability they'd spent decades trying to avoid triggered every protective instinct they possessed. But their proposed solutions invariably involved abandoning what I'd already built rather than finding ways to strengthen or stabilize it. They couldn't imagine that freelance work might evolve into something more secure and profitable over time. They couldn't see how the skills I was developing and the relationships I was building might eventually create opportunities that traditional employment couldn't offer. "You're so talented," Rachel would say, and the compliment always contained an implicit criticism. "You could easily get hired at any design firm in Cleveland. You'd have steady income, health insurance, paid vacation time. Why make things so much harder than they have to be?" The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of my motivations and goals. Rachel assumed that I was choosing difficulty for its own sake, pursuing freelance work, because I was too naive or stubborn to appreciate the advantages of traditional employment. She couldn't understand that what she saw as unnecessary hardship represented meaningful trade-offs that I was willing to make for reasons that mattered more to me than financial security. The creative control I exercised over my projects was worth more to me than the stability of a corporate paycheck. The direct relationships I built with clients provided satisfaction that I couldn't imagine finding in a large organizational hierarchy. The opportunity to work on diverse projects across multiple industries offered learning experiences that seemed more valuable than the specialized expertise I'd develop in a single company or department. But these intangible benefits were difficult to explain to people who measured career success primarily in terms of salary, benefits, and advancement opportunities. How do you convince someone that creative fulfillment justifies financial uncertainty? How do you explain that working for yourself feels more secure than depending on someone else's employment decisions? How do you defend choices that prioritize personal growth over external recognition? Carlos approached these conversations from a different angle, focusing on the business fundamentals that he believed I was ignoring or misunderstanding. Have you thought about developing a 5-year plan? He'd ask, deploying the systematic thinking that his banking training had emphasized. You need to set specific goals for income growth, client acquisition, maybe even hiring employees eventually. His suggestions weren't wrong exactly, but they reflected assumptions about business development that didn't necessarily apply to creative service. The linear progression he envisioned, where freelance work would gradually evolve into a traditional agency model, missed the possibility that individual practice might actually be more sustainable and rewarding than institutional growth. My father's contributions to these discussions typically focused on practical concerns that reflected his working-class background and blue-collar sensibilities. What happens when you get older and can't work as many hours? He'd ask. At the plant, we have union protection, pension plans, disability coverage. What kind of safety net are you building for yourself? These questions forced me to confront aspects of freelance work that I'd been avoiding or postponing. I didn't have clear answers about retirement planning, health insurance costs, or long-term disability protection. I was focused on building my business and developing my skills, assuming that financial security would somehow follow from professional success. But the absence of traditional safety nets didn't necessarily mean that freelance work was more dangerous than corporate employment. My father's generation had benefited from union protections and pension plans that were disappearing from the modern economy. Corporate employment no longer offered the security it once had, and many of my college classmates who'd chosen traditional career paths were discovering that company loyalty wasn't reciprocated with job security. The conversations about my career choices often revealed generational divides that went beyond simple misunderstanding. My parents had entered the workforce during an era when the social contract between employers and employees included implicit promises about long-term stability and mutual obligation. They'd built their retirement plans around employer-sponsored benefits and company pensions that might not exist for my generation. Rachel and Carlos, despite being closer to my age, had chosen career paths that mimicked the templates our parents had provided, perhaps hoping that traditional approaches would offer the same security that previous generations had enjoyed. But they were operating in an economic environment that had fundamentally changed, even if the changes weren't yet fully visible to people who'd established their careers within existing institutions. My choice to work independently wasn't a rejection of security or financial responsibility. It was a response to economic realities that made traditional employment less reliable and less rewarding than it had been for previous generations. But because my methods didn't look like the ones that had worked for my family, they appeared risky and irresponsible. The emotional toll of these ongoing conversations was significant. Every family gathering became an opportunity for well-meaning intervention attempts. Every update about my work prompted questions that highlighted its limitations rather than celebrations that acknowledged its successes. Every expression of satisfaction with my career choices was met with gentle suggestions about alternatives that might be more practical or secure. Over time, this constant scrutiny began to erode my confidence in decisions that had previously felt natural and appropriate. I started second-guessing choices that had been based on careful consideration of my skills, interests, and goals. I began to wonder whether my family's concerns reflected wisdom I was too young or stubborn to appreciate. The most damaging aspect of this doubt was how it interfered with my ability to pursue opportunities that required confidence and commitment. When potential clients asked about my long-term availability or my capacity to handle larger projects, I found myself hedging in ways that undermined my credibility. When networking opportunities arose that required significant time investment without guaranteed returns, I hesitated because I could hear my family's voices questioning whether such efforts were worthwhile. This internal conflict between my own instincts and my family's expectations created a kind of paralysis that affected both my personal satisfaction and my professional development. I was simultaneously trying to build something meaningful according to my own values while also preparing to defend or abandon those choices if my family's predictions about their sustainability proved accurate. What my family couldn't see because it didn't fit their template for recognizing professional development was that I was actually building something far more substantial and sophisticated than my modest lifestyle suggested. Every project I completed added layers to a foundation of skills, relationships, and industry knowledge that would eventually support opportunities they couldn't yet imagine. The restaurant chain project, which my family had characterized as small business work, connected me with a network of entrepreneurs and business owners who were transforming Cleveland's economic landscape in ways that wouldn't become visible for years. These weren't the established corporate leaders who dominated the Chamber of Commerce and downtown business associations. They were innovators and risk-takers who were creating new industries and new approaches to old problems. Through my work with the restaurant client, I met Lisa Chen, a technology entrepreneur who was developing software solutions for small business inventory management. Her startup was operating out of a converted warehouse in the flats, far from the polished corporate offices where my sister worked, but she was solving problems that would eventually affect thousands of businesses across the Midwest. Lisa hired me to design the user interface for her software platform, a project that required me to understand not just visual design principles, but also user experience research, information architecture, and the specific workflows of restaurant and retail operations. The technical challenges pushed my skills in directions that wouldn't have been possible in a traditional graphic design role. More importantly, working with Lisa introduced me to a community of entrepreneurs, developers, and investors who were building the digital economy that would eventually reshape how business operated in cities like Cleveland. These connections were invisible to my family because they didn't result in the kinds of formal networking events or industry conferences that characterized traditional business relationships. Instead, they developed through informal gatherings in coffee shops and co-working spaces, through collaborative projects that crossed traditional industry boundaries, and through online communities that connected local innovators with national and international networks of creative professionals. The relationships I was building were based on shared interests and complementary skills rather than hierarchical corporate structure. My family couldn't recognize the value of these connections because they operated according to different rules than the professional networks that had served previous generations. There were no formal membership criteria, no official titles or positions, no clear protocols for advancement or recognition. Success was measured in terms of creative output, problem-solving ability, and reputation within specific project communities, rather than salary levels or corporate position. This alternative professional ecosystem was particularly difficult for my family to understand because it blurred the boundaries between work and personal interests, between local and global markets, between established industries and emerging fields. The people I was working with might be developing mobile applications one month, consulting on urban development projects the next, and launching social enterprises focused on environmental sustainability after that. The diversity of their activities looked chaotic and unfocused to people who expected careers to follow linear progressions within established industry. But this flexibility was actually a strategic response to an economy that rewarded adaptability and continuous learning over specialized expertise in rapidly changing fields. Through my work with technology startups, I was learning about digital marketing strategies that were years ahead of what traditional advertising agencies were offering their clients. I was developing skills in user experience design, content strategy, and data analysis that were becoming increasingly valuable across multiple industries. And I was building relationships with people who would eventually become leaders in fields that didn't yet have established hierarchies or recognition systems. My collaboration with Marcus Williams, a social entrepreneur who was developing renewable energy solutions for urban communities, exemplified the kind of work that was both personally meaningful and professionally strategic. Marcus had hired me to create educational materials that would help community organizations understand the benefits and implementation processes for solar energy installation. The project required me to translate complex technical information into accessible visual formats, to understand the specific concerns and priorities of community leaders, and to develop communication strategies that would be effective across diverse cultural and educational backgrounds. The skills I developed through this work were directly applicable to corporate communications, public health campaigns, and educational program development. But because Marcus's organization was a nonprofit startup working in environmental justice, rather than established corporation with a recognizable brand, my family couldn't appreciate the sophistication of the work or its potential implications for my career development. They saw volunteer work or charity projects, rather than professional experience that was preparing me for opportunities in emerging fields. The financial aspects of my work were equally invisible to my family's methods of evaluation. Because my income came from multiple sources and varied significantly from month to month, they couldn't use traditional metrics to assess my financial progress. They didn't see the steady increase in my hourly rates, the growing percentage of repeat clients, or the expanding scope of projects I was being hired to complete. More importantly, they couldn't recognize that I was building intellectual property and business assets that would eventually generate income without requiring my direct involvement. The brand identities I developed, the content strategies I created, and the systems I designed were foundations for ongoing relationships that would evolve into consulting arrangements, licensing agreements, and collaborative partnership. My work with Jennifer Rodriguez, who was launching an online platform for connecting freelance professionals with small businesses, illustrated this potential for compound returns on creative investment. I designed her company's visual identity and user interface for significantly less than market rates, because I believed in her vision and wanted to be part of building something innovative. As her platform grew and began generating revenue, our relationship evolved from a simple client service provider arrangement into a strategic partnership where I provided ongoing creative direction in exchange for equity in the company. This kind of arrangement was completely outside my family's framework for understanding professional relationships, but it represented exactly the kind of opportunity that could eventually provide both creative satisfaction and financial security. The education I was receiving through these diverse projects was equivalent to an advanced degree in business strategy, technology implementation, and creative problem solving. But because it happened through practical application rather than formal course, because it was customized to my specific interests and goals rather than standardized curriculum, and because it was funded through client payments rather than tuition costs, my family couldn't recognize its value or legitimacy. Every challenge I navigated, every difficult client I managed, every technical problem I solved was adding to a reservoir of knowledge and experience that would eventually enable me to take on projects and responsibilities that my current modest circumstances couldn't suggest. But this learning was invisible to people who equated education with degrees, and professional development with formal training programs. The cumulative effect of this work was that I was developing a professional identity and skill set that was uniquely suited to an economy that was rapidly evolving away from the industrial and corporate models that had defined my parents' generation. I was learning to operate across traditional industry boundaries, to build businesses around creative services, and to navigate professional relationships based on collaboration and mutual benefit rather than hierarchical authority. But because this evolution was happening gradually through small projects and incremental improvements, rather than through dramatic transitions or formal announcements, it was almost completely invisible to my family. They saw only the surface indicators that suggested instability and limitation, missing entirely the foundation I was building for long-term success in fields that were just beginning to emerge. While my immediate family struggled to understand the value of my unconventional career path, there was one person who not only recognized what I was building but actively encouraged me to think bigger about its potential. Patricia Morales had been my professor during my final semester at Cleveland State University, teaching a course in digital communications that bridged traditional graphic design with emerging technology application. Unlike most of my academic instructors, who focused primarily on theoretical frameworks and historical design movements, Professor Morales brought decades of real-world experience from her consulting work with Fortune. She'd spent 15 years helping major corporations navigate digital transformation initiatives, working with brands like Procter & Gamble, Progressive Insurance, and KeyCorp to modernize their customer communication strategy. What made Professor Morales unique wasn't just her impressive client list or her academic credentials, it was her ability to see connections between seemingly unrelated trends, to identify emerging opportunities before they became obvious to mainstream business leaders, and to understand how technological changes would reshape entire industries in ways that most people couldn't yet imagine. During my senior year, she'd noticed my tendency to approach design projects from a strategic business perspective rather than purely aesthetic consideration. While other students focused on visual impact and creative execution, I consistently asked questions about target audiences, competitive positioning, and measurable outcomes. This approach had set my work apart in ways that attracted her attention and sparked conversations that extended far beyond classroom requirements. "Emma," she'd said after reviewing my final portfolio project, "you're thinking like a business strategist who happens to use design as a communication tool. That's a rare combination, and it's going to become increasingly valuable as companies realize they need to integrate creative services with broader organizational strategy." At the time, I'd appreciated the compliment, but hadn't fully understood its implication. I was focused on graduating and finding clients who would pay me to create visual identities and marketing materials. The idea that my work might eventually evolve into something more comprehensive and strategic seemed ambitious beyond my immediate reality. But Professor Morales had maintained contact with me after graduation, following my career development, with the kind of invested interest that suggested she saw potential I hadn't yet recognized in myself. She'd refer occasional clients my way, introduce me to other professionals in her network, and offer feedback on projects that helped me refine both my creative and business skills. More importantly, she provided perspective on my career choices that countered the concerned skepticism I was encountering from my family. When I expressed frustration about their inability to understand what I was building, she'd remind me that innovation always looked chaotic and risky to people who were comfortable with established systems. "Your family wants to protect you from failure," she explained during one of our quarterly coffee meetings at Arabica in Little Italy, "but they're defining failure according to standards that may not apply to the career you're actually building. Sometimes the biggest risk is playing it safe in a rapidly changing environment." Professor Morales had watched entire industries transform over the course of her consulting career. She'd seen companies that seemed invulnerable disappear because they couldn't adapt to new technologies and changing consumer expectations. She'd also seen entrepreneurs and freelancers who'd seemed marginal and unstable eventually become industry leaders because they'd positioned themselves at the intersection of emerging trends. "The work you're doing now," she continued, stirring her cortado while studying my latest project samples, "is preparing you for opportunities that don't exist yet, but will be essential within the next 5 to 10 years. Companies are going to need people who understand both creative strategy and digital implementation, who can work across traditional industry boundaries, and who can build relationships with diverse stakeholder groups." These conversations provided validation that I desperately needed during periods when my family's concerns began to undermine my confidence in my chosen path. Professor Morales wasn't just offering encouragement, she was providing strategic analysis based on decades of experience with business transformation initiatives. Her perspective helped me understand that what looked like instability to my family might actually be preparation for a career that would eventually offer both creative satisfaction and financial security. But perhaps most importantly, Professor Morales introduced me to opportunities that would accelerate my professional development in ways that working in isolation never could have achieved. Through her connections with the Cleveland State University Business Development Center, she arranged for me to participate in a pilot program that paired creative professionals with technology startups seeking design and marketing support. The program, called Innovation Collaborative, brought together entrepreneurs who had technical expertise but lacked creative and communication skills with designers, writers, and marketing professionals who wanted to learn about emerging technologies and startup business models. Participants worked on real projects with real budgets, but the collaborative structure provided mentorship and learning opportunities that traditional client relationships typically didn't include. My first Innovation Collaborative project connected me with David Kim, a software engineer who was developing inventory management systems specifically designed for small retail businesses. David had created functional software that solved real problems for his target market, but his user interface was clunky, his marketing materials were amateurish, and his pricing strategy hadn't been tested against competitive alternatives. Working with David's startup gave me insight into technology development processes, software business models, and the specific challenges that entrepreneurs face when trying to scale innovative solutions. I learned about user experience research, conversion optimization, and the importance of creating communication strategies that could explain technical benefits in terms that non-technical decision makers could understand and appreciate. But the collaboration also taught David about the strategic value of professional design and marketing services. He'd initially viewed creative work as cosmetic enhancement rather than fundamental business infrastructure. Through our partnership, he began to understand how visual design, content strategy, and user experience planning could directly impact customer acquisition, retention, and revenue growth. The results of our collaboration were immediate and measurable. The user interface redesign reduced customer support calls by 30% because the software became more intuitive and easier to navigate. The new marketing materials increased qualified leads by 45% because they communicated benefits more clearly and addressed specific customer concerns more effectively. The pricing strategy adjustments, based on competitive analysis and customer research, increased average transaction values by 20%. David's business transformed from a struggling startup with a few dozen users to a growing company with hundreds of customers and expansion plans that attracted investor interest. My role in that transformation established my reputation within Cleveland's entrepreneurial community as someone who could bridge the gap between technical innovation and market success. More importantly, the project demonstrated the kind of comprehensive business impact that creative services could achieve when they were integrated with broader strategic planning, rather than treated as standalone aesthetic enhancement. This understanding would eventually reshape how I positioned my services and the types of clients I pursue. Professor Morales watched this development with obvious satisfaction, not just because her introduction had led to a successful project, but because it validated her predictions about the evolution of creative professional roles. During our next coffee meeting, she shared observations about industry trends that helped me understand the broader context for what I was experiencing. 20 years ago, she explained, companies had clear boundaries between different types of expertise. Engineers handled technical problems, marketers handled communication challenges, designers handled visual elements. But digital transformation has blurred those boundaries, because successful solutions require integrated thinking across multiple disciplines. The most innovative companies, she continued, were beginning to hire people who could work across traditional departmental silos, who understood how technical capabilities connected with market opportunities, and who could communicate complex ideas to diverse audiences. These hybrid professionals were becoming increasingly valuable because they could facilitate collaboration between specialists who might otherwise struggle to understand each other's perspectives and priorities. You're developing exactly that kind of hybrid expertise, Professor Morales observed. You understand design principles, but you also understand business strategy. You can work with technical teams, but you can also communicate with non-technical stakeholders. That combination is going to become essential as more companies realize they need integrated approaches to innovation and growth. Her analysis helped me recognize that the diverse project experience I was accumulating wasn't just building a portfolio of creative work. It was developing a professional skill set that would eventually enable me to take on leadership roles that didn't exist within traditional corporate hierarchies, but were becoming essential for organizations navigating digital transformation. The Innovation Collaborative program also connected me with other creative professionals who were building similar hybrid careers. Through monthly networking events and project showcases, I met graphic designers who were learning about web development, writers who were specializing in technical communication, and photographers who were expanding into video production and social media strategy. These relationships provided both peer support and collaborative opportunities that helped counteract the isolation that freelance work could create. We began referring clients to each other, collaborating on projects that required diverse skill sets, and sharing insights about industry trends and business development strategy. Most importantly, this community of creative entrepreneurs validated my career choices in ways that my family's well-meaning concerns couldn't undermine. These were smart, ambitious professionals who'd made similar decisions about pursuing independence over traditional employment. Their success stories provided concrete examples of how unconventional career paths
could lead to both personal satisfaction and financial security. Sarah Martinez, a content strategist who'd left her corporate marketing position to focus on helping nonprofits improve their digital communication, had built a consulting practice that generated twice the income she'd earned in her previous role while allowing her to work on projects that aligned with her values. Tom Chen, a web developer who specialized in e-commerce solutions for local businesses, had created a company that employed 6 people and served clients throughout the Midwest. These weren't fairy tale success stories that ignored the challenges and risks of entrepreneurial career, but they were realistic demonstrations that creative professionals could build sustainable businesses that provided both financial stability and meaningful work. Their experiences helped me understand that the path I was following wasn't as unusual or risky as my family believed. Professor Morales continued to serve as a mentor and advisor as my career developed, but she also became something more valuable, a champion who helped me recognize the significance of what I was building before it became obvious to outside observers. Her perspective allowed me to maintain confidence in my strategic choices, even when the immediate results didn't match my family's expectations for traditional career advancement. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late October while I was working from my favorite corner table at Rising Star Coffee in Ohio City. I'd been struggling with the user interface design for a complex project management software application, trying to find ways to make enterprise-level functionality accessible to small business users who didn't have extensive technical training. The caller identified herself as Dr. Amanda Foster, Director of Strategic Partnerships at Cleveland State University's Technology Transfer Office. She explained that Professor Morales had recommended me for a consulting opportunity that would be unlike anything I'd worked on previously, both in terms of scope and potential impact. We're working with a consortium of regional universities to develop new approaches to technology commercialization, Dr. Foster explained, her voice carrying the careful enthusiasm of someone who was excited about a project but couldn't reveal all the details over an initial phone call.
The initiative involves multiple stakeholders, significant funding, and outcomes that could influence how academic institutions across the Midwest approach innovation and entrepreneurship. The project, she continued, required someone who could work across traditional boundaries between academic research, business development, and public policy. They needed creative and communication strategies that would help diverse stakeholder groups understand complex information, make informed decisions, and coordinate activities across institutional and geographic boundaries. Professor Morales suggested that your background in design and business strategy, combined with your experience working with both technology startups and traditional organizations, might make you uniquely qualified to help us develop comprehensive communication solutions. The opportunity intrigued me, but I was also intimidated by the scope and complexity Dr. Foster was describing. This wasn't a small business branding project or a nonprofit communications campaign. This was regional economic development work that would involve university administrators, government officials, private investors, and technology entrepreneurs. The budget was larger than anything I'd ever managed, and the timeline extended over multiple years rather than weeks or months. During our meeting the following week in the sleek conference room at CSU's Business Development Center, Dr. Foster provided details that made the project's significance even clearer. The consortium had received a multi-million-dollar federal grant to create new models for translating academic research into commercial applications. The goal was to accelerate innovation in fields like advanced manufacturing, renewable energy, and biotechnology by improving collaboration between universities and industry partners. Traditional technology transfer approaches aren't working effectively in today's economy, Dr. Foster explained, gesturing toward charts and graphs that illustrated declining rates of successful commercialization, despite increasing research investment. Academic institutions generate tremendous intellectual property, but too much of it never reaches markets where it could solve real problems and create economic value. The communication challenges were substantial. University researchers spoke different professional languages than business executives, used different metrics for measuring success, and operated according to different timelines and risk tolerances. Government agencies had their own priorities and procedures. Private investors brought yet another set of expectations and requirements. The consortium needed communication strategies that could bridge these gaps, helping diverse stakeholder groups understand each other's perspectives and work toward shared goals. They needed visual tools for presenting complex information, digital platforms for facilitating ongoing collaboration, and messaging frameworks that could generate public support for innovation initiatives. We're not looking for traditional marketing or public relations services, Foster clarified. We need strategic communication solutions that can actually improve how different types of organizations work together to accelerate innovation and economic development. The project would involve extensive research into stakeholder needs and preferences, collaboration with subject matter experts across multiple fields, and the development of comprehensive communication systems that could be adapted and replicated by other regional consortium. It was exactly the kind of integrated, high-impact work that Professor Morales had predicted would become increasingly important. But perhaps most significantly, the project would position me as a strategic advisor to leaders at major universities, government agencies, and private companies throughout the region. The relationships and reputation I would build through this work could open doors to opportunities that weren't yet visible but would likely become available as similar initiatives developed in other markets. I accepted the consulting contract with excitement tempered by awareness that this project would test my abilities in ways that my previous work hadn't required. The complexity of managing relationships with dozens of stakeholders, the pressure of working on initiatives with regional economic implications, and the visibility that came with federal funding represented new challenges that would push my professional development in directions I couldn't yet anticipate. The first phase of the project involved comprehensive stakeholder research that required me to conduct interviews with university administrators, technology entrepreneurs, government officials, and private investors throughout Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. These conversations provided insight into innovation ecosystems that I'd never encountered, revealing both opportunities and obstacles that weren't visible from outside these professional communities. University technology transfer officers described frustration with commercialization processes that moved too slowly for fast-changing markets. Entrepreneurs explained difficulties accessing university research that could accelerate their product development timeline. Government economic development specialists outlined challenges coordinating resources across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Private investors discussed risk assessment criteria that often disadvantaged early-stage academic spin-off. Each stakeholder group operated according to different assumptions about how innovation should work, what outcomes mattered most, and who should bear responsibility for various aspects of technology commercialization. The communication challenges weren't just about translation between technical and business languages, they involved fundamental differences in organizational cultures, professional priorities, and strategic objectives. Developing solutions that could address these complex, interconnected challenges required research methods and analytical frameworks that extended far beyond traditional design processes. I found myself learning about organizational psychology, economic development theory, and public policy implementation. I studied successful technology transfer models from other regions, analyzed failure patterns in previous commercialization initiatives, and interviewed experts who'd spent decades working on innovation and entrepreneurship issues. The education I received through this research was equivalent to graduate-level coursework in business strategy, public administration, and economic development. But because it was applied learning focused on solving real problems for real organizations, it provided practical knowledge that academic programs typically couldn't offer. More importantly, the research process connected me with thought leaders and decision-makers throughout the regional innovation ecosystem. These weren't just professional contacts, they were potential mentors, collaborators, and champions who could provide access to opportunities that wouldn't be advertised through traditional job postings or business development channels. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the Vice Provost for Research at Case Western Reserve University, became particularly interested in my approach to stakeholder analysis and communication strategy development. During our initial interview, she'd asked probing questions about my methodology that revealed her own sophisticated understanding of organizational change management and strategic planning processes. Most consultants come in with predetermined solutions, she observed near the end of our 2-hour conversation. You're actually trying to understand the underlying dynamics that create the problems we're asking you to solve. That's unusual and valuable. Dr. Chen's background included both academic leadership and private sector consulting experience. She'd served on corporate boards, advised government agencies, and led major research initiatives that involved coordination between universities, companies, and nonprofit organizations. Her perspective on innovation and technology transfer was informed by decades of experience with successful and failed collaborative efforts. The challenge isn't technical, she explained during a follow-up meeting where she provided feedback on my preliminary research findings. We know how to move research from laboratories to markets. The challenge is organizational and cultural. Different types of institutions have different incentive structures, different success metrics, different risk tolerances. Effective collaboration requires understanding and addressing those differences. Her analysis confirmed insights I'd been developing through my stakeholder interview, but she also provided strategic context that helped me understand how the consortium's work could influence innovation policy and practice far beyond the specific universities and companies involved in the current initiative. Regional innovation ecosystems are interconnected, Dr. Chen continued. Successful models get studied and replicated. Federal agencies watch pilot programs to identify approaches that should be scaled nationwide. If this consortium can demonstrate improved outcomes, it will influence how billions of dollars in research funding get allocated and managed. This perspective helped me understand that the communication strategies I was developing weren't just tools for improving collaboration among current stakeholder groups. They were potentially foundational elements for new approaches to innovation and economic development that could be implemented across multiple regions and institutional contexts. The responsibility was both exciting and intimidating. My work could contribute to systemic changes that would affect how universities, companies, and government agencies approached technology commercialization throughout the Midwest and potentially beyond. But it could also fail to achieve its ambitious objectives, potentially undermining future support for innovative approaches to regional economic development. The consortium project consumed most of my professional attention for the next 18 months, but it also created opportunities for related work that began to establish my reputation as someone who could navigate complex stakeholder environments and develop communication solutions for challenges that traditional marketing approaches couldn't address effectively. Foster introduced me to colleagues at other universities who were working on similar initiatives, leading to consulting contracts with Ohio State University, University of Cincinnati, and Wright State University. Each project involved different combinations of stakeholders and different specific challenges, but they all required the kind of integrated strategic thinking that combined creative problem-solving with business analysis and organizational development. The Ohio State project focused on improving communication between their medical school researchers and healthcare companies interested in licensing breakthrough treatments and diagnostic technology. The University of Cincinnati initiative involved developing new approaches to collaboration between engineering faculty and advanced manufacturing companies. Wright State needed help connecting their cybersecurity research programs with government agencies and private contractors working on national security applications. These projects were interconnected in ways that created compound learning opportunities and relationship-building benefits. Success at one university led to referrals and recommendations that opened doors at other institutions. Expertise developed through work with healthcare companies proved relevant to projects involving manufacturing and technology firms. Government agency contacts from the cybersecurity project provided insights that enhanced my understanding of innovation policy and funding mechanisms. But perhaps most importantly, this portfolio of university consulting work positioned me at the intersection of academic research, business development, and public policy in ways that were attracting attention from organizations far beyond the regional consortium that had provided my initial opportunity. The call from Sterling Communications came on a Friday afternoon in March, while I was reviewing draft communication materials for the Wright State cybersecurity project. The receptionist explained that Rachel's supervisor wanted to discuss potential collaboration opportunities, and could I come in for a meeting the following Tuesday,
My immediate reaction was confusion mixed with curiosity. Rachel had never mentioned that her company was working on university partnerships or technology transfer initiatives. Sterling Communications specialized in traditional advertising and marketing services for established corporate clients. Their work focused on brand development, media campaigns, and promotional activities, rather than the kind of strategic communication consulting I'd been doing with academic institutions. When I mentioned the meeting invitation to Rachel during our next family dinner, her reaction suggested she was equally surprised. "I had no idea Mr. Richardson was aware of your work," she said, and I could hear both genuine puzzlement and slight concern in her voice. "He's never mentioned university consulting in any of our strategy meetings." Rachel's relationship with her supervisor had been professional but somewhat distant. James Richardson was a second-generation CEO who'd inherited Sterling Communications from his father and focused primarily on maintaining established client relationships rather than pursuing new market opportunities. He was known for conservative business practices, careful growth strategies, and skepticism about trends that couldn't be evaluated through traditional return on investment calculation. "Maybe he's thinking about expanding into educational marketing," Carlos suggested when Rachel shared the news with the broader family. Universities spend millions on student recruitment and donor development campaigns. But when I arrived at Sterling Communications the following Tuesday for my meeting with Mr. Richardson, the conversation quickly revealed that his interest had nothing to do with traditional marketing services. He'd been following the consortium project through industry publications and professional networks, and he'd begun to understand that communication challenges related to innovation and technology transfer represented a potentially significant market opportunity. "Emma," he began after the preliminary introductions and coffee offers, "I've been reading about the university consortium work you've been managing. The outcomes seem impressive, and the federal agencies involved are talking about scaling similar approaches to other regions." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the careful attention of someone who was reassessing previous assumptions. "I'm beginning to think that Sterling Communications has been too narrowly focused on traditional marketing service. Companies are dealing with communication challenges that require more strategic thinking and more sophisticated solutions than conventional advertising can provide." Mr. Richardson had built his career by identifying emerging market trends before his competitors recognized their significance. In the 1990s, he'd positioned Sterling Communications as a leader in integrated marketing communications, when most agencies were still treating different media channels as separate specialties. In the early 2000s, he'd invested in digital marketing capabilities when many traditional agencies were dismissing online advertising as a marginal supplement to print and broadcast media. "The work you've been doing with universities represents exactly the kind of strategic communication consulting that I think will become increasingly important across multiple industries," he continued. "Companies are dealing with complex stakeholder relationships, regulatory changes, and technological disruptions that require communication strategies that go far beyond traditional marketing approach." His analysis was remarkably similar to observations that Professor Morales had been making about the evolution of creative professional roles, but coming from a successful agency. Richardson wasn't just validating my strategic choices, he was suggesting that those choices had positioned me for opportunities within established business organizations that were beginning to recognize the need for new approaches to communication and stakeholder engagement. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of bringing you into Sterling Communications as Director of Strategic Communication Services," he said, and the title made my stomach flip with excitement and anxiety. The position would involve developing new service offerings that integrate traditional marketing with the kind of stakeholder analysis and communication strategy work you've been doing with the university consortium. The offer was extraordinary in multiple ways. The director-level title represented a significant advancement in professional status and responsibility. The salary was nearly double what I'd been earning through freelance consulting, and the benefits package included health insurance, retirement, contributions, and paid vacation time, that would address my family's primary concerns about the instability of independent work. But perhaps most importantly, the position would enable me to build and lead a new department within an established agency, creating opportunities to hire other creative professionals and develop innovative service offerings that could influence how communication consulting evolved throughout the region. Mr. Richardson explained that the position would involve both client work and business development responsibility. I would lead projects similar to the University Consortium Initiative, but for corporate clients dealing with stakeholder communication challenges related to mergers and acquisitions, regulatory compliance, crisis management, and strategic partnership. I would also be responsible for developing new service offerings, training other staff members, and representing Sterling Communications at industry conferences and professional associations. The goal is to position Sterling Communications as the regional leader in strategic communication consulting, he said. Traditional advertising and marketing services are becoming commoditized, but strategic communication work requires expertise that can't easily be replicated by competitors who don't understand the complexity of stakeholder analysis and relationship management. The opportunity was everything my family had been hoping I would find: a prestigious position with an established company, a title that commanded respect, and compensation that would enable financial security and long-term plans. But it also represented validation of the career path I'd chosen, proof that the skills I'd developed and the reputation I'd built through unconventional work could translate into traditional professional advancement. During the week I spent considering Mr. Richardson's offer, I consulted with Professor Morales, Dr. Foster, and several other mentors who'd followed my career development. Their advice was unanimous: the position represented an extraordinary opportunity that would accelerate my professional growth while providing security and resources that independent consulting couldn't match. You've spent years building expertise that most people in established agencies don't possess, Professor Morales observed during our coffee meeting to discuss the opportunity. This position would give you a platform to apply that expertise at a scale that individual consulting contracts can't achieve, while also building the kind of professional credentials that will open doors throughout your career. But she also cautioned me about the potential challenges of transitioning from independent work to corporate employment. You'll be working within organizational constraints that don't exist when you're freelancing, she explained. You'll need to navigate office politics, manage staff members, and balance client needs with company priorities. Those are different skills than the ones you've been developing as a solo practitioner. The decision ultimately came down to recognizing that the position offered opportunities for impact and influence that extended far beyond my personal career advancement. As Director of Strategic Communication Services at Sterling Communications, I could help other creative professionals develop similar hybrid skill sets, create innovative approaches to complex communication challenges, and demonstrate that strategic consulting could generate significant value for clients and agencies alike. I accepted Ms. Richardson's offer with excitement about the opportunities ahead, and gratitude for the unconventional path that had prepared me for responsibilities I couldn't have imagined when I'd started working from coffee shops and living from project to project. The journey from freelance designer to agency director had taken 4 years, but it had also involved learning experiences and relationship-building activities that would continue to influence my career for decades to come. The transition from independent consultant to agency director happened faster than I'd anticipated, largely because Mr. Richardson was eager to capitalize on momentum from the University Consortium project before competing agencies recognized the market opportunity. Within 6 weeks of accepting the position, I was managing an office staff of 3 people, overseeing client projects worth more than I'd earned in any previous year, and representing Sterling Communications at industry conferences and professional association meetings. The most immediate challenge was establishing credibility within an organization where I was simultaneously the newest employee and a senior leader responsible for developing innovative service offerings. Most of Sterling Communications' existing staff had traditional advertising and marketing backgrounds that emphasized creative execution and media strategy, rather than the kind of strategic analysis and stakeholder engagement that characterized my approach to communication consulting. Rachel's initial reaction to my hiring was a complicated mixture of pride, confusion, and concern about how our new professional relationship would affect our family dynamic. She'd spent 3 years building her reputation and advancing her career at Sterling Communications, and suddenly her younger sister was joining the company at a director level with responsibilities that extended across multiple departments. "I'm happy for you," she said during a private conversation in her office during my first week, "but I'm also worried about how this is going to work. People are already asking questions about whether you got the position because we're related, and I don't want either of us to be affected by perceptions about favoritism or nepotism." Her concerns were legitimate and professionally astute. Corporate environments often generate suspicions about hiring decisions that involve family members, particularly when those decisions result in rapid advancement or responsibilities that seem disproportionate to obvious qualifications. The fact that my background was significantly different from traditional agency credentials would make those suspicions more likely and potentially more damaging. Richardson had anticipated these challenges and structured my role in ways that minimized potential conflicts while maximizing opportunities for collaboration between my new department and existing agency services. The Strategic Communication Services Division operated as a semi-autonomous unit within Sterling Communications, with separate budgets, distinct client relationships, and specialized staff members who reported directly to me rather than to supervisors in other departments. This organizational structure allowed me to hire team members whose backgrounds complemented my own expertise, while also creating opportunities for collaboration with Rachel's department on projects that required both strategic communication consulting and traditional marketing services. Rather than competing for resources or recognition, our departments could work together on comprehensive client solutions that neither could provide independently. The first major test of this collaborative approach came through a project with Midwest Medical Systems, a regional healthcare network that was navigating a complex merger with 2 smaller hospital organizations. The client needed communication strategies for managing relationships with regulatory agencies, employee unions, patient advocacy groups, and community leaders who were concerned about potential changes to local healthcare services. Traditional marketing approaches weren't adequate for addressing the diverse concerns and information needs of these different stakeholder groups. Regulatory agencies required detailed technical documentation about operational changes and compliance procedure. Employee unions needed clear information about job security, benefit modifications, and career development opportunities. Community leaders wanted reassurance about service quality and accessibility that went beyond promotional message. The project required extensive stakeholder research, customized communication strategies for different audience groups, and coordination between multiple internal departments and external organizations. It was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes initiative that demonstrated the value of strategic communication consulting, while also showcasing how new approaches could enhance traditional agency services. Rachel's team contributed essential expertise in media relations, brand development, and promotional campaign management that complemented my department's work on stakeholder analysis, message development, and relationship management. The collaboration was successful both for the client, who achieved smoother merger implementation than comparable healthcare consolidations, and for Sterling Communications, which demonstrated capability for comprehensive communication solutions that differentiated the agency from competitors. More importantly, the project established my credibility within the organization while providing Rachel with exposure to strategic communication approaches that enhanced her own professional development. Rather than creating competition or conflict between us, our collaboration opened opportunities for both of us to expand our expertise and advance our careers within the agency. The success of the Midwest Medical Systems project generated referrals and recommendations that brought additional clients with similar complex communication challenges. A regional manufacturing company needed help managing stakeholder relationships during a major facility modernization that would affect employment levels and environmental impact. A technology startup required communication strategies for navigating intellectual property disputes while maintaining relationships with university research partners and private investors. Each project reinforced demand for the kind of strategic communication consulting that traditional agencies hadn't been offering, while also demonstrating the business value of integrating new approaches with established marketing and advertising service. Within 6 months, the Strategic Communication Services division was generating revenue that exceeded Mr. Richardson's most optimistic projections, and we were receiving inquiries from potential clients throughout the Midwest. The professional recognition that accompanied this rapid growth was particularly satisfying because it validated career choices that my family had questioned for years. The same unconventional path that had seemed risky and impractical was now generating opportunities for advancement and influence that traditional employment approaches couldn't have provided. But perhaps most importantly, the transition to agency director enabled me to create opportunities for other creative professionals who were building similar hybrid careers.
As the Strategic Communication Services division expanded, I was able to hire consultants, designers, and researchers whose backgrounds combined creative skills with business strategy expertise. These team members brought diverse perspectives and specialized knowledge that enhanced our collective ability to address complex client challenges. Sarah Kim, a former nonprofit development director who'd transitioned into freelance grant writing and fundraising consulting, brought expertise in stakeholder engagement and relationship management that proved invaluable for projects involving multiple organizations and competing priorities. Marcus Rodriguez, a graphic designer who'd developed specialized knowledge in data visualization and information architecture, contributed skills that were essential for projects requiring clear presentation of complex technical information. These hiring decisions created a department culture that valued diverse professional backgrounds and encouraged innovative approaches to communication challenges. Rather than conforming to traditional agency hierarchies and standardized service offerings, the Strategic Communication Services division operated more like a consulting collaborative where team members could develop specialized expertise while contributing to shared learning and collective problem solving. The impact of this approach extended beyond individual project outcomes to influence how Sterling Communications positioned itself within the regional business community. The agency's reputation evolved from traditional marketing services provider to strategic communication partner, capable of addressing complex organizational challenges that required integrated solutions and sophisticated stakeholder management. This transformation attracted attention from industry publications, professional associations, and business leaders who were dealing with similar communication challenges at their own organizations. Within 12 months of joining Sterling Communications, I was invited to speak at the Ohio Association of Business Communicators annual conference, serve on the advisory board for Cleveland State University's professional communication program, and contribute articles to trade publications that reached thousands of marketing and communication professionals throughout the Midwest. These speaking and writing opportunities further enhanced both my professional reputation and Sterling Communications' market position, creating compound benefits that extended far beyond immediate client work. The agency began attracting talent from competitors who wanted to work on more strategic and impactful projects. Clients started approaching us with more complex and lucrative consulting contracts, and industry recognition opened doors to national opportunities that wouldn't have been accessible to a smaller, regionally focused agency. But the most significant transformation was personal rather than professional. The combination of meaningful work, financial security, and public recognition for expertise I'd spent years developing created a sense of career satisfaction that I'd hoped for, but hadn't been sure was achievable. The path from freelance designer to agency director had been unconventional and sometimes uncertain, but it had also been uniquely suited to my interests, abilities, and goals in ways that traditional career advancement couldn't have met. The Sterling Communications annual Client Appreciation Gala represented everything that my family valued about professional success, held at the Cleveland Museum of Art, The event brought together the city's business elite in an atmosphere of sophisticated networking and corporate celebration. For Rachel, who had spent months coordinating logistics and client relations for the evening, it was an opportunity to showcase her event management skills and strengthen relationships with key accounts. The invitation had arrived at my parents' house 3 weeks earlier, formally requesting the pleasure of the Rodriguez family's company at Sterling Communications' premier social and business event. My mother had spent considerable time selecting appropriate attire. My father had researched the museum's current exhibitions to prepare conversation topics, and Carlos had arranged to leave work early so he could attend what he clearly viewed as an important family milestone. For my parents, the gala represented validation that at least 2 of their children had achieved the kind of professional recognition that warranted inclusion in Cleveland's business community. Rachel's role as event coordinator demonstrated her advancement within an established agency, while my position as director suggested that perhaps my unconventional career path had eventually led to legitimate success. The irony, which I was acutely aware of as I prepared for the evening, was that my family still didn't fully understand what my professional responsibilities actually involved or how significantly my work had begun to influence Sterling Communications' reputation and growth trajectory. They knew I had a director title and a substantial salary, but they interpreted these achievements through frameworks that didn't capture the strategic importance of what I'd been building. The museum's Great Hall was elegantly arranged with cocktail stations, display areas showcasing Sterling Communications' recent campaign work, and conversation spaces that encouraged mingling between clients, staff members, and invited guests. As we entered the reception area, I could see Rachel moving efficiently between different groups, ensuring that clients felt welcomed and that staff members were positioned to facilitate meaningful business conversation. My parents were clearly impressed by the venue, the catering quality, and the obvious expense that Sterling Communications had invested in creating a memorable experience for their clients and partners. "This is quite an event," my father observed, accepting a glass of wine from a circulating server. "Rachel's company must be doing very well to afford this kind of hospitality." Carlos was studying the campaign displays with professional interest, analyzing the creative work and strategic messaging from his banking perspective. "These are sophisticated marketing materials," he commented. "The brand development work looks like what we see from agencies that serve Fortune 500 companies." What they couldn't see, because the Strategic Communication Services division operated somewhat separately from traditional advertising work, was that several of the most impressive campaign elements had actually been developed through collaborative projects between Rachel's department and my team. The hospital merger communication strategy, the manufacturing facility modernization campaign, and the technology startup media relations program all represented integrated approaches that combined traditional marketing with strategic stakeholder engagement. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversations with clients and industry colleagues who were familiar with my work but had never met my family. These interactions created opportunities for my parents and siblings to hear external perspectives on my professional reputation and the impact of projects I'd been managing. Rebecca Chen, who had become both a client and a mentor through the university consortium work, approached our group during the cocktail hour with obvious enthusiasm about reconnecting. "Emma," she said warmly, "I was hoping you'd be here tonight. I wanted to thank you again for the incredible work you did on our technology transfer initiative. The communication strategies you developed have become models that other universities are studying and implementing." My mother's polite smile brightened with genuine interest as Dr. Chen continued. "Your daughter has become quite well known in academic and business circles for her innovative approaches to stakeholder communication. The consortium project she led has influenced federal policy recommendations and attracted national attention from organizations that are working on similar innovation initiatives." The conversation continued, with Chen describing specific outcomes and recognition that my work had generated, but I could see my parents processing this information with expressions that suggested surprise rather than simple pride. They were learning details about my professional impact that I hadn't effectively communicated during family dinners, partly because the significance wasn't obvious without context they didn't possess. Similar interactions occurred throughout the evening as other clients and colleagues shared their perspectives on projects I'd managed and outcomes I'd achieved. Marcus Williams, whose renewable energy nonprofit had hired me for educational material development, explained how the communication strategies I'd created had helped his organization secure significant grant funding and partnerships with major corporations. Emma's work didn't just improve our marketing materials, he told my family. She helped us understand how to communicate with different stakeholder groups more effectively, which transformed our ability to build coalitions and influence policy decisions. The strategic thinking she brought to our project made the difference between modest local impact and regional leadership in environmental justice. These conversations were revealing the gap between my family's understanding of my career and the reality of what I'd been building over the past several years. They were hearing from respected professionals about work that had influenced university policies, federal funding decisions, and regional economic development strategy. But this was the first time they'd received external validation for achievements I'd struggled to explain in terms they could readily understand. The most significant moment of the evening came when James Richardson approached our group to introduce himself and express appreciation for my family's support of my career development. As CEO of Sterling Communications, his presence and attention carried obvious importance that my parents immediately recognized and respected. Mr. and Ms. Rodriguez, he began with the confident warmth of someone accustomed to representing his organization at high-level social events. I wanted to personally thank you for raising such an exceptional daughter. Emma has transformed our agency's capabilities and reputation in ways that exceed our most optimistic expectations. He continued with specific details about the Strategic Communication Services Division's performance. The national recognition Sterling Communications had received for innovative consulting approaches, and the competitive advantages my work had created in markets that other agencies couldn't effectively serve. When I hired Emma 18 months ago, Richardson explained, I knew she had impressive experience and unique expertise, but I didn't anticipate how quickly she would establish our agency as the regional leader in strategic communication consulting, or how significantly her work would influence our growth and market position. The conversation took on additional significance when Ms. Richardson mentioned that Emma Rodriguez had become something of a celebrity in professional communication circles, with speaking engagements at national conferences and articles in industry publications that were reaching audiences throughout the country. Your daughter isn't just succeeding within our organization, he told my parents. She's helping to define new approaches to communication consulting that are being studied and adopted by agencies and corporations across multiple industries. The work she's doing here in Cleveland is influencing how professionals think about stakeholder engagement and strategic communication nationwide. I could see my parents exchanging glances that suggested they were recalibrating their understanding of my professional achievements and their implications. This wasn't just stable employment with good benefits. This was industry leadership and national recognition for expertise they hadn't fully appreciated when it was developing through freelance projects and university consulting contracts. But the most dramatic moment of recognition came later in the evening, when Rachel was introducing family members to colleagues and clients during the formal networking portion of the gala. She had been moving through the crowd with practiced professionalism, facilitating conversations and ensuring that important business relationships were being maintained and strengthened. When she approached a group that included several of Sterling Communications' most prestigious clients, Rachel began her usual introduction routine. I'd like you to meet my family, she said with obvious pride. These are my parents, Miguel and Sofia Rodriguez, my brother Carlos, and this is my sister Emma, who works in. The hesitation in Rachel's voice reflected her ongoing uncertainty about how to describe my role within the organization and the broader industry. Despite working in the same agency for over a year, she still didn't fully understand what strategic communication consulting involved or how it differed from traditional marketing and advertising service. But before she could complete the introduction, David Morrison, CEO of Midwest Medical Systems and one of Sterling Communications' largest clients, interrupted with obvious recognition and enthusiasm. Emma Rodriguez, he said, stepping forward with an extended hand. You're Director Rodriguez, the strategic communication expert who managed our merger integration. I've been telling colleagues throughout the healthcare industry about the incredible work you did for our organization. The expression on Rachel's face shifted from confident professionalism to confusion
and surprise as David Morrison continued. Director Rodriguez developed communication strategies that made our merger process smoother and more successful than any of the integration consultants predicted. Her stakeholder analysis and relationship management approaches have become templates that other healthcare systems are studying. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Rachel was clearly processing the realization that the sister she'd been introducing as someone who does various consulting projects was actually being recognized by major corporate clients as a director-level strategic expert whose work had influenced industry practices. The momentum of Morrison's recognition created a cascading effect as other clients in the group began sharing their own experiences with my work. Sarah Chen from TechStart Innovations described how the communication strategies I'd developed had helped her company navigate complex intellectual property negotiations. Michael Torres, from Regional Manufacturing Alliance, explained how my stakeholder engagement approaches had prevented community relations disasters during their facility modernization project. Director Rodriguez has become the go-to consultant for complex communication challenges that require sophisticated strategic thinking, Morrison concluded. Her reputation extends far beyond Cleveland. We've recommended her approaches to colleagues in Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh who were dealing with similar stakeholder management issues. As the group conversation continued, I could see my family absorbing information that fundamentally changed their understanding of my professional status and industry reputation. The career path they'd viewed as risky and unconventional had apparently led to recognition and influence that exceeded what traditional employment advancement typically provided. The drive home from the gala was unusually quiet, with each family member apparently processing what they'd learned about my professional achievements and their implications for assumptions they'd held about my career choices. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it carried the weight of recognition that significant revelations had occurred that would require adjustment of long-held perspectives and expectations. My mother was the first to speak as we turned into their neighborhood. "Mija," she said softly, using the endearment that always indicated serious conversation, "we had no idea that your work had become so important. The people at the gala were talking about you like you're some kind of expert that everyone knows about." The conversation that followed, first in the car and then continuing for several hours in my parents' living room, represented the most honest and comprehensive discussion we'd ever had about my career choices, their concerns about my unconventional path, and the outcomes I'd achieved that they hadn't previously understood or recognized. "We thought you were still struggling to establish yourself professionally," my father admitted with obvious embarrassment about his previous assumption. "The way you talked about your projects made them sound like small jobs for local clients, not the kind of strategic work that influences major corporations and government agencies." Their confusion was understandable because I hadn't effectively communicated the scope and significance of what I'd been building. Partly this was because the work had evolved gradually, with each project adding layers of expertise and recognition that weren't obvious without comprehensive context. But partly it was because I'd learned to downplay my achievements during family conversations, to avoid seeming boastful or creating comparison pressures for Rachel and Carlo. "I didn't want to make it sound like I was bragging," I explained, "and honestly, I wasn't sure how to explain work that doesn't fit traditional job categories." Strategic communication consulting is still a relatively new field, and most people don't understand what it involves or why it's become important for organizations dealing with complex stakeholder relationships. Rachel, who had been unusually quiet during the drive home, finally voiced the questions that had clearly been bothering her since the client recognition at the gala. "Emma, how did you become a director before I did?" "I've been working at Sterling Communications for 3 years, and I'm still a coordinator." "You've been there for 18 months, and you're running your own department." The question contained layers of confusion, competitive concern, and genuine curiosity about career advancement that she hadn't previously understood. Rachel had been following traditional promotion pathways within established organizational hierarchies, while I had been building expertise that created opportunities for leadership roles that hadn't existed when I started working at the agency. "The position exists because I created it," I explained, trying to help her understand how entrepreneurial career development differed from traditional advancement approaches. Mr. Richardson hired me to develop new service offerings that Sterling Communications hadn't offered before. The Strategic Communication Services division didn't exist until I built it. This distinction between filling existing roles and creating new opportunities was crucial for understanding how professional landscapes were changing in response to evolving client needs and market conditions. Traditional career paths assumed that advancement happened within established structures, but innovation often required building new structures that could address challenges existing approaches couldn't solve effectively. Carlos approached the revelations from his analytical banking perspective, asking questions about revenue generation, profit margins, and business sustainability that reflected his ongoing concern about the financial viability of creative careers. So this strategic communication work is actually profitable enough to support a whole department. The clients are paying premium rates for services they can't get from traditional marketing agencies. His questions provided opportunities to explain market dynamics that weren't visible to people working within established industries, but were becoming increasingly important across multiple sectors. Organizations were dealing with stakeholder relationships, regulatory challenges, and reputation management issues that required specialized expertise that traditional service providers couldn't offer. Companies are realizing that communication problems can create business problems that are much more expensive than hiring experts to prevent them, I explained. The consulting fees seem high until you compare them to the costs of failed mergers, regulatory penalties, community relations disasters, or stakeholder conflicts that damage organizational reputation and operational effectiveness. The economic logic was compelling for Carlos, who understood risk management and cost-benefit analysis from his banking experience. But the conversation also revealed how professional opportunities were shifting towards specialized expertise rather than general business skills, toward innovative problem-solving rather than routine task completion. My parents' concerns had always focused on security and stability, but they were beginning to understand that traditional employment no longer offered the reliability they remembered from their own career experiences. Your sister and brother have steady jobs, my mother observed, but you've built something that seems more substantial, more like owning a business than working for someone else. This observation was particularly insightful because it recognized that my position at Sterling Communications combined aspects of entrepreneurship with benefits of organizational affiliation. I had created and managed my own department, developed innovative service offerings, and built client relationships that generated significant revenue for the agency. But I also had the infrastructure support, marketing resources, and professional credibility that came from association with an established firm. It's the best of both worlds, I agree. I have the creative control and strategic influence that I valued about freelance work, plus the security and resources that come from being part of a larger organization. And because I built the department from scratch, I have more autonomy and advancement potential than traditional corporate roles typically offer. The family conversation continued past midnight, covering topics we'd never discussed comprehensively before. My parents shared their fears about my career choices that had been based on their experiences with economic instability and limited opportunity. Rachel and Carlos talked about their own career aspirations and concerns about whether traditional advancement approaches would provide the satisfaction and security they were seeking. Most importantly, we began to develop shared understanding about how professional landscapes were changing and what success might look like for our generation compared to previous ones. The stability my parents had achieved through steady employment in established industries was less available to people entering the workforce in the 21st century. But new opportunities were emerging for professionals who could navigate uncertainty and build expertise in areas that weren't yet fully developed. I think we've been measuring your success against standards that don't apply to the career you've actually built, my father concluded. We wanted to protect you from risks we understood, but we didn't recognize opportunities that we hadn't experienced ourselves. The acknowledgement was both validating and emotionally significant, because it represented recognition that my choices had been strategic rather than reckless, informed rather than naive. The unconventional path that had seemed risky and uncertain had actually been preparation for opportunities that more traditional approaches couldn't have provided. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.